In the autumn of 1947, in the windswept expanse of Pembina County, North Dakota, a strange structure began to take shape on Anton Bruner's quarter section of land. The land itself was unremarkable, a flat plate of earth under an immense sky, distinguished only by its proximity to the Canadian border and the relentless, soul-scrubbing wind that scoured it year-round. His neighbors, men and women hardened by the Great Depression and the prairie's unforgiving cycles, were practical people. They built with what they knew, thick, honest logs hewn from the wooded river bottoms, or sturdy frame houses clad in clapboard, their designs proven over 2 generations of settlement. They banked their foundations with soil, chinked their logs with mud and moss, and laid in formidable stacks of cottonwood and oak for the coming winter. Their actions were a familiar rhythm, a communal hymn of preparation against the cold. Anton Bruner, however, moved to a different beat. A recent immigrant, a quiet man with a watchmaker's precise movements and eyes that seemed to be taking constant, minute measurements of the world, he did not build with logs. First, to the astonishment of those who passed on the dirt road, he assembled a surplus military Quonset hut. The curved, corrugated steel arch, designed for barracks and storage in climates from the Pacific tropics to the European winter, shimmered under the pale autumn sun, a metallic scar on the organic landscape. It was cheap, and it went up fast. But then he began the second, far more bewildering phase of his project. He started building a wall of stone around the hut. Not against it, but around it, leaving a deliberate, measured gap of 18 inches between the metal skin and the inner face of his stonework. Day after day, he hauled fieldstones from the corners of his property, rocks that the glacier had left behind, and with the patient deliberation of a man building a cathedral, he laid them one by one. The community watched, and the community talked. At the general store in nearby Cavalier, his project was a source of constant, derisive amusement. They called it foolish. They called it wasteful. "He's building a fence around a house," one farmer scoffed over the Cracker Barrel. Jedediah Miller, a man whose own sprawling log home was a point of county-wide pride, was the most vocal critic. His grandfather had broken this land, and Jedediah felt a deep proprietary ownership of its accumulated wisdom. "That metal shed will be an icebox come January," he declared to anyone who would listen. "The steel will draw the cold right in, and that stone wall, it'll just hold it there. The man is building himself a tomb." Others nodded in agreement. The sheer labor of it seemed perverse, a misapplication of the energy every settler needed for the real work of survival. They saw a man wasting the precious autumn weeks on an architectural absurdity, while his neighbors were wisely stockpiling fuel and sealing their sensible wooden homes. 2 years later, when the great blizzard of 1949 descended upon the northern plains like a white apocalypse, Jedediah Miller's magnificent log home would become a frigid trap, its great room impossible to heat, its walls radiating a deadly chill. The sturdy frame houses of his neighbors would become drafty prisons where families burned furniture to fend off frostbite. But inside Anton Bruner's strange, stone-wrapped curiosity, a single small stove would burn with a placid, economical flame, keeping the space a quiet, stable, and life-sustaining 70 degrees Fahrenheit as the world outside shrieked and froze. The structure they had mocked as a tomb would become the region's only ark. What did Anton Bruner, a quiet Swiss immigrant who had spent the war years repairing the delicate gears of watches in Zurich, understand about thermal mass, convective loops, and captive air that everyone else, so confident in their frontier experience, dismissed as madness? The answer lay thousands of miles away and decades in the past, in a small village nestled high in the Swiss Alps. Anton was born and raised in a world of stone and extreme cold. The houses in his valley were not the log cabins of North American folklore. They were fortresses against winter. They were built with thick stone walls, sometimes several feet thick, with small windows and low ceilings to conserve heat. He had grown up with an innate, cellular understanding of thermal dynamics that was not learned from books, but absorbed through the soles of his feet on the warm stone floors and the feel of the still, cool air in the cellar. His family were not just farmers, they were masons, a trade passed down through generations. He had learned from his grandfather how to read a stone, how to place it for maximum stability, and how to use mortar not just as a binder, but as a seal against the wind. More importantly, he carried with him the memory of a specific architectural principle, a piece of alpine folk science known locally as the Doppelwand, or double wall. The oldest and most successful barns in his valley, the ones that kept livestock alive through the bleakest winters, were often built this way. They had a primary inner structure of wood and an outer, non-structural wall of stone or thick planks with a gap between them. In the summer, this gap, ventilated at top and bottom, would create a cooling convective current. In the winter, the gap would be stuffed with hay, creating a massive, if informal, layer of insulation. The principle was simple. The outer wall took the brunt of the wind and the direct cold, while the inner wall, protected within that buffer zone, was responsible only for containing the heat of the animals within. The air, or the hay, in between was the true barrier. It was not the thickness of a single wall that mattered most, but the separation of the outer and inner envelopes. This principle was reinforced during his mandatory service in the Swiss Army. Stationed in mountain fortifications carved into the rock, he saw the same idea applied with military precision. Living quarters were built as insulated boxes inside larger rock caverns, ensuring that the soldiers' body heat and small stoves were not wasted trying to warm an entire mountain. The rock provided impenetrable security from attack, but it was the captive airspace between the rock and the wooden barracks that provided security from the lethal high-altitude cold. When Anton emigrated to America after the war, seeking land and quiet solitude, he brought these memories with him. They were as much a part of his luggage as his watchmaker's tools and his few precious books. Upon arriving in North Dakota, he did not immediately begin building. He spent his first year living in a small rented room, working and observing. He listened to the local farmers, but he also sought out those who had been on this land far longer. He spent several afternoons with an elderly Lakota man named Chayton, who lived on the edge of the Turtle Mountain Reservation. Anton, through a mixture of gestures and patient questions, inquired about how his ancestors had survived the winters before the coming of the log cabin. Chayton, seeing a genuine curiosity in the quiet immigrant that he did not see in the other settlers, took him to see the sunken, circular remains of an old earth lodge. He explained that these were not simple huts. The thick, sod-covered walls, sometimes several feet thick, created a massive shell of thermal mass. The earth itself became the insulation. In the summer, the lodge stayed cool, and in the winter, once heated by a central fire, it held that heat for an astonishingly long time, moderated by the stable temperature of the deep earth. The structure did not fight the winter. It negotiated with it, using the ground's own properties to create a livable space. For Anton, this was a profound confirmation. The Lakota Earth Lodge and the Swiss Doppelwand were different expressions of the same universal principle. Survival in extreme cold was not about burning more and more wood to fight heat loss through a single, inadequate barrier. It was about creating a layered defense. It was about thermal mass to absorb and slowly release energy. And it was about creating a pocket of still, captive air to act as the ultimate insulator. Dead air, he knew, conducted heat far less effectively than any solid material. A pane of glass is cold to the touch in winter. 2 panes of glass, with air trapped between them, are significantly warmer. It was the air, that invisible nothingness, that did the real work. The Quonset hut, a product of modern industrial might, was cheap and provided a perfectly sealed inner envelope against air leakage. The stones of the prairie, a gift of the ancient glaciers, would provide the thermal mass and the outer shield against the wind. And the 18 inches of air he would leave between them, that would be his masterstroke. That would be the invisible wall, more effective than any log or stone. The construction began in late August. First came the foundation, a simple slab of concrete poured directly onto the compacted earth, with a moisture barrier of tar paper laid beneath. This alone was unusual. Most built on stone piers, believing a crawl space was necessary. Anton wanted the stable temperature of the earth directly connected to his living space. He assembled the Quonset hut himself, a task for which his precise nature was well suited. The steel ribs were bolted together, and the corrugated sheets were methodically attached, each seam sealed with a tar-like mastic. From the inside, the arching metal created a space 40 feet long and 16 feet wide, a perfect half-cylinder. He framed in the 2 ends with wood, planning for a single door and 2 small windows at the front and a small utility door at the back. Then the real labor began. He built a second, wider foundation of poured concrete around the first, leaving the critical 18-inch gap. This would be the footing for his stone wall. He used no modern equipment, just a wheelbarrow, a shovel, and the strength of his own back and arms. Each morning, he would walk his land, selecting stones. He was not just gathering rocks, he was choosing them, studying their shapes, imagining their place in the wall. He would pry them from the soil, some the size of loaves of bread, others requiring all his strength to roll onto a stone boat, a simple sledge he had built from planks. He then dragged them to the construction site. His technique was slow and exact. He mixed his mortar by hand in a wheelbarrow, a rich mixture of sand, cement, and lime. He would lay a thick bed of mortar and then carefully place a stone, tapping it with the handle of his trowel until it was perfectly set, nestling it against its neighbors. The outer face of the wall was kept relatively plumb and orderly, but the inner face, the one that looked across the air gap toward the Quonset hut, was left rougher. He was building a wall that was 2 feet thick, a massive undertaking. By the end of September, the wall was only 3 feet high, a long gray ring of stone encircling the shimmering hut. This was when the commentary from his neighbors truly began to intensify. Jedediah Miller made a special trip over one afternoon, reining in his horse and watching Anton work for a good 10 minutes before speaking. Jedediah's own home, visible a mile down the road, was a testament to frontier ambition. with a soaring roofline and a two-story great room featuring a massive stone fireplace he had built himself. It was a house that proclaimed success and mastery over the environment. He looked at Anton's slow, tedious work and the bizarre structure taking shape, and he felt a mixture of pity and contempt. "Bruner," he called out, his voice carrying easily on the wind. "A man could build a whole cabin in the time it's taking you to build that pen." Anton paused, wiped his brow with the back of a gloved hand, and nodded a simple greeting. "It is slow work." "It's foolish work, is what it is," Jedediah pressed on, dismounting and walking closer, his boots crunching on stray pebbles. "I told you before, that metal is going to be the death of you. It'll sweat in the summer and be coated in a half-inch of frost on the inside come winter. You know how cold metal gets, and all these stones," he gestured dismissively at the wall, "they'll just soak up the cold like a sponge and hold it right next to you all winter long. You're building a refrigerator, man, plain and simple." He then offered his own well-meaning, if condescending, advice. "There's still time. You could tear down this nonsense, use those end walls for a proper frame, and get yourself a real house up before the hard freeze. You should be building with good, honest logs. A log wall breathes. It holds the heat. It's what works out here." Anton listened patiently, his gaze never wavering. He looked at Jedediah's proud face, then at the half-built stone wall, and then at the empty space between the wall and the hut. He picked up his trowel and pointed with its tip into the gap. "The air is the important part," he said, his English still carrying the precise, clipped accent of his native German tongue. It was not an argument, it was a statement of fact. Jedediah just shook his head, a smirk playing on his lips. He clearly thought Anton was either simple-minded or mad. "Air? It's the coldest thing there is out here, Bruner. You've been in this country a year and you haven't learned that yet?" He laughed, a short, sharp bark, and walked back to his horse. "Don't come knocking on my door in January when you're freezing in your tin can." Anton did not watch him leave. He turned back to his work, selected another stone, and carefully troweled a bed of mortar for it. The mockery did not anger him. It was predictable. These men saw materials. They saw wood, stone, metal. They did not see the invisible principles that governed them. They understood the brute force of a thick log wall, but not the elegant physics of a thermal break. He kept a simple ledger book, and in it he had calculated the projected fuel usage for a standard log cabin of this size versus his own design. His calculations, based on principles he knew to be true, suggested he would use less than a third of the wood his neighbors would. The ledger, like his stonework, was an act of faith in a different kind of wisdom. As the wall grew higher, so did his quiet confidence. The school teacher, Eleanor Vance, would sometimes stop on her way home, not to mock, but to sketch the strange structure in her journal. She asked him once what he was building. He gave her the same answer he gave Jedediah, a warm house. But to her he added, "The outer wall is the winter coat. The inner wall is the sweater. The air between is the important part. It keeps the sweater dry and still." She wrote his words down verbatim, intrigued by the poetry of his engineering. By the first week of November, the work was done. The stone wall rose to the very apex of the Quonset's arch, completely encapsulating it. At the front, he had built a more traditional-looking facade of flat-faced stones, with a deeply recessed front door and two small square windows. He had ordered these windows special from Fargo, triple-pane glass, an unheard-of luxury. The entire structure looked like a long stone and mortar mound, a part of the earth itself, with only the hint of a conventional doorway to suggest it was a human dwelling. He had also integrated his woodshed into the back of the structure, a lean-to space within the stone perimeter, accessible through a small, insulated door at the rear of the hut. He could retrieve firewood without ever stepping outside. At the top of the stone wall, hidden under a small stone cap, he had installed two small, baffled vents that could be opened or closed from the inside with a simple pull chain. These were for summer ventilation. For the winter, they would be sealed shut, trapping the air in the cavity completely. His work was finished. Now, all he could do was wait for winter to provide its unsparing test. The winter of 1948 to 49 began with unusual mildness, lulling the northern plains into a false sense of security. But on January 2nd, the bottom fell out of the sky. The day began cold but clear. By noon, the sky had turned a sickly, bruised gray, and the wind began to pick up, a low moan that quickly escalated into a high-pitched shriek. The temperature plummeted. It dropped 10 degrees in an hour, then 20. By nightfall, it was 20 below 0 Fahrenheit, and the wind was a steady 50 miles per hour, gusting to over 70. Then the snow began, not in flakes, but in a horizontal blinding torrent. This was not a storm. It was a terrestrial hurricane of ice and wind. The radio, before it went silent, called it the Great Blizzard of 1949. It would rage for 4 days, burying everything in its path under mountainous drifts and claiming lives across 4 states. Inside Jedediah Miller's proud log home, the reality of his architectural folly set in with terrifying speed. The massive stone fireplace, which had been such a majestic centerpiece, was now a ravenous, inefficient beast. It consumed split logs at an alarming rate, yet most of its heat went straight up the chimney. The great room, with its 20-foot ceiling, became an impossible volume to heat. The warm air rose, pooling uselessly near the rafters, while the lower level remained frigid. The wind, driven by a pressure that defied all previous experience, found every microscopic gap in the chinking. It was not a draft. It was a constant penetrating infiltration of Arctic air. Ice began to form on the inside of the walls, the logs themselves becoming conduits of cold. The windows, single panes of glass, were completely opaque, covered in a thick, fern-like lacework of frost that grew thicker by the hour. By the second day, the situation was desperate. Jedediah's woodpile, which he had thought so immense, was buried under a 10-foot drift that was packed as hard as concrete. He had to tunnel his way out of the back door just to get to it, a Herculean effort that left him exhausted and frostbitten. He could only bring in a few logs at a time. The house was failing. His elderly mother, who lived with them, was wrapped in every blanket they owned, her breathing shallow, her body shivering uncontrollably in a corner near the stove. His wife, Mary, tried to keep their infant son warm, huddling with him under a pile of coats, but the baby's cries were becoming weak and thin. The temperature inside the main room hovered just above freezing. They sealed off the rest of the house and huddled together, the grandeur of their home now a bitter, deadly irony. Similar scenes were playing out across the county. In the thinner walled frame houses, the wind tore at siding and shattered windows. Families burned their furniture, their books, anything that would feed the fire, fighting a losing battle against the encroaching cold. Meanwhile, a mile away, inside Anton Bruner's stone-wrapped hut, the world was strangely quiet. The outer stone wall, 2 feet thick and dense with glacial rock, took the full screaming force of the 70-mile-per-hour wind. It did not shudder or vibrate. It stood impassive, a breakwater against the storm. The wind that hammered the wall was diffused, its energy broken, creating a pocket of relatively still, calm air in the 18-inch cavity. The Quonset hut, protected within this sanctuary, experienced no wind load at all. The only sound from the storm was a distant, muted howl, like a beast growling outside a very thick door. The physics of his design were performing exactly as he had calculated. His stove, a small, efficient, cast-iron model, burned with a steady, parsimonious flame. The heat it produced radiated into the curved, compact space of the hut. The corrugated metal walls, which Jedediah had predicted would be conduits of cold, were instead perfect, fast-responding radiators. They heated up quickly and evenly, filling the small volume with warmth. The heat rose, followed the curve of the ceiling, and descended on the other side, creating a gentle, continuous convective loop that kept the temperature uniform throughout the space. There were no cold spots. The concrete slab floor, connected to the deep earth, was cool but not frigid, its temperature a stable 35 degrees, acting as a moderator. The true genius, however, was the layered defense. The inner metal hut contained the heat. The outer stone wall blocked the wind, and the captive air between them performed its crucial, invisible task. The outer surface of the metal hut was warm. The inner surface of the stone wall was brutally cold, far below freezing, but the 18 inches of perfectly still air between them formed a powerful thermal break. Heat's desperate attempt to escape from the hut and equalize with the Arctic outside was stymied. It could not effectively conduct across the air. It could not convect because the air was trapped and still. The only significant heat transfer was through radiation, and even that was minimal. Anton's house was not fighting the cold. It was largely ignoring it. His wood, stored in the integrated shed, was dry, accessible, and plentiful. He used a fraction of the fuel Jedediah was burning, yet his home was an island of stable, comfortable warmth. Anton was not idle. He was a man of science and data. Throughout the storm, he continued to make entries in his ledger. At 8 a.m. on the third day, he recorded the outdoor temperature, estimated from a thermometer he had mounted in a sheltered spot, at 32 degrees below zero. He then recorded the indoor temperature, 68 degrees Fahrenheit. He noted the number of logs he had added to the stove in the past 24 hours, 12. He performed a small test, lighting a sliver of paper and holding it near the edges of his door and windows. The flame barely flickered. There were no drafts. His creation was not just a shelter, it was a perfectly functioning machine for living. He felt a quiet, deep satisfaction, not of pride, but of confirmation. The principles were sound. The wisdom of his ancestors, augmented by the materials of a new world, had held true against one of the worst storms in recorded history. On the fourth day, as the storm raged unabated, a new sound penetrated the quiet of the hut. It was a frantic, desperate pounding on the heavy wooden door. Anton opened it to a nightmare. A figure, completely covered in snow and ice, stumbled forward and collapsed onto the floor. It was Jedediah Miller. His face was a mask of frostbite, his lips blue, his eyes wide with panic and exhaustion. He was barely coherent, his words choked by gasps and shivers. "Wood, all gone," he stammered. "The fire's out. My mother, the baby, Mary. Please, help." There was no hint of triumph in Anton's face, no echo of "I told you so." The time for mockery and vindication was long past. This was a matter of life and death. He acted with the same calm efficiency he applied to all things. He helped Jedediah to a chair near the stove, wrapped him in a thick wool blanket, and gave him a cup of hot broth he had been simmering. Then, without a word, he began to prepare. He pulled on his own heavy winter gear, thick felt boots, canvas overalls, a fur-lined hat, and goggles. He grabbed a coil of rope, a small shovel, and a tightly packed canvas bag containing medical supplies and thermoses of hot liquid. He strapped them to a sturdy sled he kept by the door. "Show me the way," was all he said. Jedediah, shivering violently but with a flicker of hope returning to his eyes, could only nod. Anton tied one end of the rope around his own waist and the other around Jedediah's. In the blinding, zero-visibility conditions, it was their only hope of staying together. He opened the door, and the two men plunged into the white fury of the blizzard, leaning into a wind that felt like a solid wall. When Jedediah entered the Brunner hut for the second time, this time supporting his wife while Anton carried the limp, bundled form of his infant son, the contrast between his world and this one struck him with the force of a physical blow. The first thing he noticed was the quiet. The screaming of the wind was gone, replaced by a profound, peaceful silence. The second was the quality of the warmth. It was not the scorching, uneven heat of an overworked stove, but a gentle, pervasive warmth that seemed to come from everywhere at once. There were no drafts. He could breathe without the air stinging his lungs. His wife, Mary, began to weep silently, a reaction not of sorrow, but of overwhelming relief. Anton methodically set about caring for them, helping to remove their frozen outer clothing and checking his mother and the baby for signs of severe hypothermia. Later, as his family slept, wrapped in warm blankets, their breathing finally deep and regular, Jedediah sat at Anton's small wooden table, staring into the gentle fire in the stove. He saw the ledger book lying open. He picked it up. He saw the neat columns of figures: outdoor temperature, indoor temperature, fuel consumption. The data was undeniable. A clinical testament to his own catastrophic failure and Anton's stunning success. He looked from the ledger to the thermometer on the wall, which read 69 degrees. He touched the curved metal wall next to him. It was warm, like the flank of a living animal. He finally understood. His pride, his generational arrogance, his belief in the self-evident truth of the log cabin. It all crumbled away in the face of this quiet, irrefutable reality. He had built a monument to frontier ego. Anton Brunner had built a machine for survival. He did not apologize. His pride was too deeply ingrained for that. But he did something more meaningful. He looked at Anton, who was checking the seal on one of the small windows, and spoke in a low, humbled voice. "The air," he said, his voice raspy. "You said the air was the important part. When we were building, what did you mean by captive air?" It was a question, but it was also a complete surrender. It was the admission of a student to a master. Anton turned, and for the first time, he smiled, a small, weary acknowledgement of this hard-won understanding. And he began to explain. When the blizzard finally broke 2 days later, the landscape that emerged was alien and transformed. Drifts 30 feet high had reshaped the terrain. The news that trickled in was grim. Livestock frozen in the fields, trains buried, and people dead in their own homes. But the story that spread most quickly through the stunned community was that of Jedediah Miller and his family, and their rescue by the very man they had all ridiculed. The story of the Brunner hut, the stone-wrapped Quonset that had remained an island of warmth and safety through the worst of the storm. In the weeks that followed, a procession of visitors made their way to Anton's home. They were not coming to mock anymore. They came with hats in hand, their faces etched with a new respect. Jedediah Miller was often there, standing by as Anton, with no fanfare or condescension, explained the principles of his design. He drew diagrams in the snow with a stick, illustrating the outer wall, the inner hut, and the critical air gap. He explained thermal mass, how the stones, once the house was warm, would help hold that warmth. He explained the concept of a sealed envelope to prevent drafts, and the efficiency of a small, well-managed stove in a compact, well-insulated space. He talked about the Swiss Doppelwand and what he had learned from Chaitin about the earth lodges. He was not just giving them a blueprint, he was teaching them a new way to think about shelter. That summer, a revolution in building practices swept through Pembina County. No new log cabins were raised. Instead, a flurry of retrofitting began. Led by a humbled and newly enlightened Jedediah Miller, families started building secondary walls around their existing homes. Those with access to stone built thick stone walls, mimicking Anton's design. Others, with more labor than money, built massive outer walls of sod, resurrecting the ancient principle of the earth lodge. They learned to value smaller spaces and lower ceilings. They sealed their attics and caulked their windows with a newfound obsession. They began to see their homes not as single barriers against the cold, but as layered systems. The Brunner Wall, as it became known, started appearing all over the county, each one a testament to a hard-learned lesson. The results were immediate and measurable. The following winter, though harsh, was different. Fuel consumption across the region dropped by an average of 40%. The local doctor reported a dramatic decrease in cases of pneumonia and other respiratory illnesses, especially among the elderly and the very young. Babies born that winter thrived in homes that were consistently warm for the first time. The quiet, life-sustaining success of the retrofitted homes was a constant daily reminder of the wisdom they had once dismissed. Miss Vance, the school teacher, wrote a long and detailed article for the Dakota Farmer magazine, complete with her own careful sketches of Anton's design and testimonials from grateful neighbors. She titled it, "The Captive Air Principle: How a Swiss Immigrant Taught a Dakota County to Survive the Winter." The article in the Dakota Farmer was a spark that lit a larger fire. It was picked up by other agricultural and homesteading journals across the northern United States and Canada. Letters began to arrive at the Cavalier Post Office for Anton Brunner from as far away as Montana and Saskatchewan, asking for details of his construction. The University of North Dakota's School of Engineering sent a young professor who spent a week with Anton, taking measurements, running calculations, and documenting the performance of the hut. The professor's subsequent report praised the design for its elegant synthesis of traditional building wisdom and modern materials, noting its exceptional performance and its ingenious use of low-cost surplus goods and locally sourced stone. Years later, As building science evolved, Anton Bruner's folk engineering would be described in more technical terms. His Quonset hut was a near-perfect air and vapor barrier. His thick stone wall provided an immense amount of thermal mass and acted as a rain screen, protecting the inner structure from the elements. The critical 18-inch gap was a buffered thermal envelope. Modern calculations would show that the still, captive air in that gap provided an R value, a measure of thermal resistance, far greater than any solid log wall of the era. The principles Anton had applied instinctively were the very same ones that would later form the foundation of high-performance building standards like the German Passive House, which relies on super insulation, air tightness, and passive heat sources. His handmade shelter on the prairie was, in essence, a direct ancestor of some of the most energy-efficient buildings in the world today. Anton Bruner lived in his stone-wrapped hut for the rest of his life. He never sought fame or recognition. He remained a quiet, methodical man, content to mend watches and tend his garden. But his legacy was built into the very landscape around him. It was there, in the stone-walled farmhouses and the sod-wrapped homes that stood as silent monuments to the blizzard that had changed everything. His story became a local parable, a reminder that true wisdom is often quiet, that innovation can come from looking to the past, and that the most powerful forces, like the insulating power of air, are often the ones that cannot be seen. It was a lesson in humility, taught by an unforgiving storm and a quiet immigrant who understood that survival depended not on fighting the prairie winter, but on intelligently yielding to its fundamental laws. In the heart of the unforgiving prairie, the warmest house was not built of wood, but of stone, metal, and the one thing the Dakota Plains had in infinite supply: still, captive air.